In the last video, we talked about some basic properties of populations, and now we're going to talk more specifically about how populations grow. So we're going to identify exponential and logistic growth. We're going to talk about various growth patterns or strategies, and then we're also going to discuss briefly limiting factors. So the first term you need to be familiar with is a biotic potential. Biotic meaning living, potential meaning the ability to. So the biotic potential is the maximum rate at which a population could increase under ideal conditions. That part's important because those ideal conditions probably don't exist in any natural population. This biotic potential is affected by multiple things, including the reproductive age, so the age at which organisms reach sexual maturity, the lifespan of an organism, the number of reproductive periods that a organism can undergo, or a species, population, and the number of offspring produced per reproduction cycle. This graph here just goes over or shows you what exponential and logistic growth looks like. Hopefully you're already familiar with this. The red line is representing exponential growth. And exponential growth occurs in populations where there are no limiting factors. And so a common example of an organism that exhibits exponential growth is bacteria. Over a period of time, they can grow exponentially. Within a period of 24 hours, you can have hundreds of colonies of bacteria. Invasive species also are categorized by exponential growth. That's actually what makes them invasive into a new environment. And then this blue line is representing logistic growth, which is characterized by an S-shaped on the graph. And this dashed line here is representing the carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is also abbreviated with the letter K. And so logistic growth is going to be experienced by populations who have limiting factors. We'll talk about what those can be in a few minutes. And so typically an example of an organism meeting this criteria are any native organisms to an area. A population can only sustain so many organisms before they reach the carrying capacity, meaning there's not enough resources. There's too much competition. And so once we start reaching this carrying capacity, we start seeing some fluctuations. These equations here are going to be important in our next video, where we're going to do a little bit of math with determining exponential growth and logistic growth population sizes. So this should be a review. What is the definition of limiting factors? Well, there are factors that limit population growth, so pretty straightforward there. And there are two types. You have density-independent limiting factors and density-dependent limiting factors. And you can kind of deduce what they mean from the name. So density-dependent limiting factors are limiting factors that are dependent on the size of the population. And so some examples of density-dependent limiting factors are things like a food shortage. Obviously, the more organisms you have with a food shortage, you're going to have a lot of competition. And so this would affect populations mostly that are fairly large. Competition for mating or mates, breeding areas, disease caused by a parasite. The more clustered organisms are, or close together they are, the more likely a parasite is going to rapidly move through that population. That's pretty common in plants. Introduction of an exotic species, increased predation, competition for water and other resources. Those are all density-dependent factors. The opposite of that, density-independent factors, are those limiting factors that don't really more so affect those populations based on size. So things like a flood, fire, spraying pesticides, destruction of a habitat, a drought, all of those things will negatively affect populations regardless of their size. It's also going to be important to talk about strategies that organisms have evolved over time, or growth patterns that they have developed. And so there are two types of reproductive strategies or growth patterns or strategists that you may see it. And so that's represented by R and K. And so individuals who are R strategists, they're typically pretty small, and they are going to hang out below the carrying capacity. So they actually take advantage of reduced crowding in an environment, unlimited resources, no limiting factors, and they experience what's called R selection. This is contrasted to individuals who are K species or K strategists. They get that name because they hang out near the carrying capacity. They're fairly larger. They often will compete for resources more so than those R strategists. And in the next slide, I'll show you a little bit more detailed table to describe the differences. So here are several characteristics, and we're going to compare R strategists to K strategists. So R strategists, lifespan, they're going to be pretty short. They're going to produce many, many offspring very early on, so that onset of maturity is pretty early. This ties into the our video on the properties of population when we started talking about survivorship curves. Their body size is going to be pretty small. Reproduction is usually going to only occur once, and they're going to do a pretty high number of offspring. They don't provide parental care, which means that most of those offspring won't necessarily survive. And they like the environment that's unstable, so an environment that is still developing. So it's not yet reached a carrying capacity. K strategists are pretty much the opposite of that. They have a very long lifespan. They produce few offspring. The onset of maturity is late. Body size, they're pretty large. They can reproduce more than once in a lifetime. They have that characteristic of providing parental care, and they enjoy a stable environment. So once that environment has reached a fairly stable population size. And so an example of an R strategist is an insect compared to a human, which would fall under a K strategist here. And so to sum up population growth, I would like to show you a case study on the lynx and the hare. And so this is an example of a predator-prey relationship. This is a pretty common question you will also see on the AP exam. And so on your y-axis you have thousands of hares, and on your or on this y-axis, on the other y-axis you have thousands of lynx. Lynx are almost like these little white rabbits, and then the hare is going to be the predator. And so we have a time frame from 1850 to 1925, and what I really want to draw your attention to is this blue line is showing the hare population, and you should see that it's experiencing several series of exponential growths and then crashes or drastic drops. And you should notice a correlation between a peak in hare and the decrease in the lynx population. So what's happening here? Well, if you see here, right around the 1850, we have about 80,000 hares. Well, the population of lynx is really low there. That's because the more hares you have, the less lynx that are going to survive, more predation. Well, when that food source is depleted, what's going to happen to the predator population? It's going to decrease. It no longer has a food supply. Once that decreases, what can the lynx do? That population size can now increase. And so you see the cyclic fluctuation between predators and prey, which is pretty common in population and predator-prey population. So just be able to read this graph and briefly explain what's going on here.